Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Tim Bobak. I'm the Regional Development Director at Group-IB for the Middle East, and today I'm going to be talking about some of the technical developments that we've seen over the past, I'd say, 8 years in sandboxing and the cat and mouse game that's being played between APT groups, cybercriminals, and the blue teams that they target. So a little bit about us. Group-IB's got a fairly long history. We were founded by a group of researchers back in 2003, focusing on investigating, responding, and also understanding the most complex cybercrimes. Over our growth, we've obviously begun to work heavily with Interpol, Europol in order to attribute and get cybercriminals arrested. We're now just over 500 staff, working internationally in a wide range of different projects, and that gives us a really interesting insight into the threat landscape as it happens at the current time, the most recent attacks, and also the development over time about how the landscapes have shifted and also what detection methodologies work in the current environment. So to talk a little bit of history, what we've seen at Group-IB is that fundamentally the game has changed in the past 2 or 3 years in terms of detecting the most advanced threats. We go back to the old days of antivirus when threat actors were lazy. We could use tools like antivirus very effectively, even tool sets that were looking into unencrypted traffic, because cybercriminals and APTs didn't really encrypt their traffic that much at that point. You're able to use IPS, IDS very easily in order to detect, malicious code or malicious traffic and have success actually doing that. Obviously, like any intelligent person that's, using a computer, coding, doing these kind of attacks, threat actors caught on pretty quickly. So they began to obfuscate their behaviors and their activity. This obviously led to next-gen AV and standard sandboxing, where behavioral-based analysis was then used in order to look into the files, how they're interacting, run that in a virtualized environment to reduce the risk. However, as again always does happen, the threat actors have got wise one more time, and so they're now looking to perform sandbox evasion. And we'll talk about some of those techniques, how threat actors are getting wise, and what you can do as an organization in order to basically respond to those kind of new hybrid attacks that are happening through sandbox evasion that might be a combination of technical and also social engineering approaches, but also how you can employ external threat intelligence, how you can employ the MITRE ATT&CK framework into understanding, contextualizing and responding in your threat detection and making that process much more effective, drilling down into the TTPs that are being used by threat actors to enhance the capabilities that you have in your blue teams, and make sure that we're dealing with the points up at the top of our pain pyramid, the more technical approaches, rather than sitting, back in 2004, 2005, handling just IOCs. So what have we seen? Obviously I mentioned the IOC approach with static analysis. Attackers became very aware that they could just simply recompile malware and then have a whole bunch of new IOCs, or they can use new infrastructure, use different C2s in order to conduct their attacks. And accordingly, the next logical step as well was people began to take the approach of getting around the classic sandboxing. So it could be, for example, by taking an integration point, so playing around with how you can deliver your emails and attachments, but also then looking on a technical basis into identifying, for example, a specific technical parameter on your target environment, which is going to give the game away. And then obviously coding to not allow your malware to then run in that particular high-risk environment so that it remains undetected, invisible to researchers, and then obviously allowing you to then come back and basically be allowed through, in fact. No coming back necessary. And so some of the first methodologies that we used were obviously looking at, for example, the date time checks, the system language. Obviously if you're using a standard sandbox, you're providing a VM that's set to Microsoft Windows US, for example, whereas the targeter will know that you're going to be using modern standard Arabic, for example, on your PC. And you might have, IP whitelisting. You might have a range of other methodologies that you can employ. Obviously, some of these are listed on a technical basis on this slide here, but the bypasses have become, I would say almost like refreshingly generic from a technical perspective. But what we have seen is that because of this, threat actors have become a little bit smarter about how they're getting around these sandboxes and how they're targeting organizations in the current threat landscape and the changes that we've seen in that area since, I would say, about 2018 through to present day, through to September of 2020. And it's become so ubiquitous now that even threat actors who we would classify as being low skill level or medium skill level on cybercrime forums, on the deep and the dark web, on places like exploit.in, or ransomware as a service, RAS actors, as we can see on the left hand side, someone selling ransomware in Python with sandboxing technique bypasses built into it, or for example payload generators like Sharpshooter. And these are being designed and built by cybercriminals for very small amounts of money. It's talking fractions of bitcoins, $50, $100 for working sandbox evasion techniques that are allowing malware to be delivered into different basically victim organizations. So it's become very broad, and this isn't just the cybercriminals. This is the APT groups, the guys who've got those big research and development budgets for attack tool deployment, for usage, for training their teams. So this is an APT problem, this is a cybercrime problem, it's even a script kiddie problem, where everyone is now aware of what everyone has got in their defensive layer. It's now not just AV, people are smart, they're understanding they have to be building in sandbox evasion into their attacks. So how does this fit into what we're talking about today, malware detonation? Well, sandboxing has become an older technology. In order to get smart, you then have to be doing more with your file analysis, more with your behavioral analysis. You have to be prodding that malware in order to get it to interact in the way that you want it to. And then you can do that obviously by doing things like customizing your VMs. But essentially what we're trying to do is get closer to the real user experience and be very, very aware of the new methodologies, the new TTPs that are being used on a daily basis, and updating those classifiers in real time. So we can take a really simple use case, for example, sending malware via email. Now, you can have the best strategic sandbox, set up, lovely, well, technical sandbox, I might add, but if it's not doing mimicking of human behavior, so for example, if you send a password protected archive, for example, let's take III here in the middle, and we see that there is a password protected archive. A normal sandbox will not be able to run that password protected archive. It might flag it, but at best. However, there might be a password that's provided to a human user in the body of the email, or say, please look in the PDF attached for the password that I've provided, or an additional email or exchange or interaction via that channel will then give an additional step that will then lead the user into opening that file, enabling macros, and then delivering a payload to their PC. So what do you need to be doing? If you're having threat actors using these kind of steps through password protective archives, then how can you then do this? What do you need to be doing? Well, first of all, you need to basically get smart and understand that in each step you need to be looking at how the threat actors are going to engage with you, how they're going to attack you. And so you can have another potential risk, for example, like malware providing pending tasks 8 hours later. Now, given that that, for example, when you receive an email, you need to brute force the archive with all of the words in order to try and open that malicious attachment that's in an archive and get into it, extract it, and then run the file. In the same way, you need to be looking at and saying, well, let's detonate the file. Let's not just have it sit in the sandbox for 2 or 3 minutes. Let's then speed up the system time in a way that holistic and is noticed by the malware, so that we can then get a view of what's actually happening long term over the course of that deployment, but in a very short period of time. Within 5 minutes you're doing 8 hours of analysis. And similarly, you've got to be doing these same kind of approaches, because threat actors are smart. They understand that I can get in around the email defenses, or let's say the end user defenses, very many different ways. I can, for example, taking a normal approach into how we've seen in some incident response cases, how threat actors are gaining access. They'll send an email, it'll go through the email security, the sandbox. There'll be a link in the body of the email saying, please see the new invoice at this link, or your DHL package is being delivered via that link. Please can you click through to see your delivery time confirmation. Just standard stuff. And that file will though not be sent during the normal working day. It'll be sent at midnight, on a Saturday night, and no one will be in the office. It won't be read. And as it goes through the email security chain and the standard sandboxing, nothing will happen, because the link won't be hosting malware. However, at 8:45 a.m., the threat actors will then enable malware to be distributed from that link, and then all of a sudden you've bypassed your hundreds of thousands or your tens of thousands of dollars of sandboxing technology just by using a simple social trick. So malware detonation is basically saying, well, we've got to be aware of these techniques, we've got to understand them, but let's recheck that. Let's recheck the link during the person's normal work routine. Let's escalate some of this. Let's pull it into an XDR framework. Let's look at files that are going in and being downloaded. Let's try and pull in from, for example, proxy downloads or ICAP, or escalate from an EDR tool. We've got to be holistic in the way that we're looking at the enterprise in order to make effective detections around sandboxing and malware detonation. And obviously we have to still remain aware that most of these attacks, most of these initial vectors are happening through email, and therefore having a series of solutions that's very smart on email downloads, but also can integrate for malware detonation, like I mentioned, onto other sources, like for example file transfers through social networks, potentially through WhatsApp, Telegram, LinkedIn as well, increasingly a vector. Some APTs relating to that in very recent weeks and months. But then also all the standard methodologies that we're aware of from various well-publicized cases, with USBs being delivered into national critical infrastructure, and industrial control systems, and other basically physically delivered malware that still remains a threat. But we have to be aware that, where are we focusing? We're focusing where the threat actors are. We've got to be plotting and updating our capabilities in line with that. And you can take a group like Silence, who've had enormous success just by taking these very, very simple steps in order to then gain access to critical infrastructure, and in these instances steal millions of dollars from the banking sector through ATMs and card processing. But again, it's very simple steps. They're very aware of the technology that's in place. And why I wanted to show Silence on today's slides is just because they were a group who actually plotted out a lot of the defensive infrastructure that was in place in banks. They read the emails that was being used by the information security teams after they'd conducted mail outs and harvested people's LinkedIn data, using tools like hunter.io, legitimate tool, in order to scrape and collect information about their targets. They're then able to obviously read emails, look into the background of the systems, read the user guides on all of the corporate information security tools that we all use. And this is then the issue, is that the attackers, Silence being one of them, they'll target you in these same methodologies as we've been talking about on email, but they're also getting smarter. And so we need to be then contextualizing our view of these kind of approaches. So when we are conducting malware detonation and sandboxing, we need to also be looking at this in the more holistic view around MITRE, and also around attack kill chain reconstruction to allow for effective threat hunting. So if you, for example, are using SOAR tools or more advanced CM capabilities and pulling in as much linking logging data as you can, Ideally, when you're using malware detonation, you should then be able to then map the various different steps that are happening, not just through the initial first chain of an infection, where we're then looking at, for example, an email client then creating a zip folder, then delivering that's obviously encrypted and getting to the winrar.exe, delivering a document that's then enabling macros, for example, through and then running a large amount of PowerShell scripts, leading to then additional infections, etc. Obviously, having that flow of data, understanding how the malwares hit your network is useful. But then also, what's great is if you can then start contextualizing that and enriching it with further data, so that you can then threat hunt across your network with those more focused MITRE frameworks. And one instance that we've seen of this is the Garmin and CWT attacks conducted by ransomware threat actors. And so we decided to spin up our own malware detonation platform for this, run some malware against it, and see what we could get out in order to guide some of the red teaming engagements that we were running, and also to provide some analytics for blue teaming organizations who are interested in more intelligence about what's happening in the cybercrime landscape. And accordingly, when you're talking about malware detonation, you should be focusing on saying, well, what do I get? I'm not just trying to block the file. I want to understand how I'm being attacked. I want to understand how they're trying to avoid my defenses. I want to understand, can I classify this further in order to then drive the threat hunting chain that's happening inside of my organization. Because it's very frequently the case that you're not just going to be targeted by one actor and then they'll go away. They're called, advanced persistent threat actors for a reason, and that's because they will target you again and again and again. If you understand their techniques and procedures and map those to a framework such as MITRE in order to give a large amount of detail and capacity for your team to then feed off of, then obviously this is going to drive. Also, first of all, you'll get an assessment of the complexity of the malware that's actually being used, but also then you can go off and hunt off the back of it. So I think to kind of take a step back, what we've seen in the period is that obviously we've moved beyond sandboxing as an industry, and we're now having to consider that organizations have to be a lot smarter in the technology that they're choosing. They're having to refresh technology, unfortunately, or at least update it aggressively, because of the fact that classic sandboxes aren't enabling teams to be doing MITRE mapping, threat hunting, extracting files from archives, performing additional contextual analysis, integrating into different XDR platforms, providing additional IOCs based off of the data that they're collecting, and mapping that, for example, to, let's say, attacker external infrastructure in an automated manner, integrating from the right points and having decent collection variability so that you can, for example, pull files out of network traffic, or not just having a static sandbox that sits in one place. So you've got to be driving this towards the evasion-proof approaches. You've got to be trying to contextualize this a lot more effectively, and that's really where we see the industry moving. So Group-IB naturally does provide, as part of our XDR platform TDS, a tool for threat hunting. In our DNA, Group-IB has always been about threat hunting, performing compromise assessments, conducting IR, and making sure that we've mapped out the full scale of an attack when we're coming in and helping remediate, driving that into our threat intelligence, understanding these attackers, contextualizing it, and then providing the tools and capabilities to our customers that we've developed in-house in order to understand the more complex threat actors that we see operating, and the commodity malware that's also being used, developed, and maintained by cybercriminal groups at the current time. So where we're going with this is obviously on a collaborative approach. We need to be also aware that we've got all of the data that's collected, all of it that's provided has to then be provided as intelligence, as API data, but also enriched. So Group-IB is providing a holistic view of the threat landscape, as I've discussed. We've touched on one very, I would say, relatively niche product, relatively niche issue inside of information security today. But what I want to do is just take this strategic step backwards and say, this is part of a broader issue, and that's that we have to be aware from an intelligence standpoint about how we engage and how we are looking at information security as a whole. And that means we've got to understand how files are hitting us, we've got to look at their behavior, but we've also got to look at the attacker's behavior and understand that they are getting smart, they're getting clever, they understand the technologies that we have in place, and accordingly, as the arms race evolves, the technologies in that arms race also have to enable the teams to effectively respond, threat hunt, and operationalize their information security processes. So from my side, I'll be very happy to take questions during the MENA Information Security Conference, obviously on a range of topics. Sandboxing and malware detonation is one of them, but obviously we at Group-IB do a range of products and services. We have a great view of the threat landscape from our threat intelligence. We have a great understanding of different kinds of cybercrime, cyber fraud, brand protection, digital risk, incident response, forensics, and compromise assessments. So we'll be very happy to engage, touch on these points, and work with all of our partners and engaging in cybersecurity and sharing that knowledge, sharing that experience more broadly. So thank you very much for the time. It's been a pleasure, and we look forward to further engagement.